Hey, this is Barbara, and this is our review for Test 3. Okay, just a quick review of some of the vocabulary that you want to make sure you have a good handle on at this point, because these are the terms we're going to use to talk about the parts of a sentence. We talked a lot about clauses. Okay, remember that a group of words with a subject and a verb in traditional grammar is called a clause. It's an important term. Any group of words with a subject and a main verb is a clause. And then we talked about two different kinds of clauses, independent clauses and subordinate clauses. Remember that an independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself as a sentence. A subordinate clause, even though, because it's a clause, it does have a subject and a verb, but even though it has a subject and a verb, it can't stand by itself as a sentence. It's subordinate or dependent on an independent clause to work in a sentence. If it's not attached to an independent clause, we're going to have a sentence fragment. We talked about coordinating conjunctions, which come up in all sorts of ways in grammar. We coordinate many things. We can coordinate subjects or direct objects. But in this unit, we were looking at them carefully because we were using them to form compound sentences. Do you remember we said a compound sentence is a sentence that has two or more independent clauses that are connected either with one of the coordinating conjunctions. Remember we said that was the fanboys trick there. We had for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Okay, so that's one of the ways we can connect two independent clauses to form a compound sentence. We can also form a compound sentence by putting a semicolon in between the two independent clauses. And simple sentence, which I'm kind of skipping over, but simple sentence, you'll remember, is a sentence that has only one independent clause by itself. So all the sentences we looked at in the first couple of units were simple sentences. And then the sentence we spent the most time on was the complex sentence. That's a sentence that has an independent clause and one or more subordinate clauses. So all the sentences we looked at that had adverb clauses or adjective clauses or noun clauses were complex sentences. So make sure you know the difference between these three kinds of sentences: simple, compound, and complex. So compound sentence, once again, two independent clauses. It could be more, but we're just saying two to keep it simple. Two independent clauses joined with a coordinating conjunction, so one of the little fanboys things there, or a semicolon. And here's our example sentence. You can make the popcorn, and I will put butter on it.
What is it? Hey, why it's buttercup popcorn.
It's distracting, but okay. So you can see this pretty clearly falls into the pattern that we can recognize here. You can make, I will put. So you can see that each independent clause has its own subject and verb, right? And we have a coordinating conjunction here, not a subordinating conjunction. So that's another good sign that we have a compound sentence and not a complex sentence. Here's our comma. Comma is, again, the traditional rule in a compound sentence before the coordinating conjunction. All right, compound sentence? Yeah? The formula for a complex sentence is the subordinate clause with an independent clause. And again, the adjective clause sentences, adverb clause sentences, noun clause sentences, those were all existing inside complex sentences. So we had one of the subordinate clauses that was anchored to an independent clause. That's the formula for a complex sentence. Okay, some of the features of a subordinate clause. Remember, it's a clause, so that's the reminder that you always need a subject and a verb. If you can't actually find a subject and a verb, it can't be a clause. Again, too, remember that to complicate things, this could be elliptical. So we saw some examples of verbs that were left out, that were not there, but there. You know, they were like invisible, but they really were there. So I think we had an example that was, my son is taller than I. Okay, than I. But notice that there really is kind of a hidden verb at the end, than I am. And when you think of it that way, you can recognize that. Notice that there really is kind of a hidden verb at the end, than I am. And when you think of it that way, you can recognize that whole thing as an adverb clause of comparison. But make sure that you remember that that am is really there, because that's how you're going to recognize that you're dealing with a clause. So you're going to need, of course, always a subject, always a verb, then I am. Remember, too, that a subordinate clause needs a subordinating word. That's why it's called a subordinate clause. And again, that might be left off. We saw very often that might not be there. Well, it's there, but it might be invisible, or as our friend Michael says, it might be the phantom that. I like that. That's helpful. So, but even though it might be left off, you still should be able to kind of add it. You know, just imagine what that word would be and stick it in there, and that should make sense and it should work, and you should be able to recognize what the missing subordinating word is. But remember that you do need a subordinating word, okay? You need a subject and verb, you need a subordinating word, and you need to be able to identify it as either an adverb clause, an adjective clause, or a noun clause. It needs to be one of those, and it should be sort of easy to recognize which one. If you're really puzzled, maybe you don't actually have a clause. Maybe you've bracketed something else. So if you absolutely can't tell if it's an adverb or an adjective or a noun, look at it again more carefully. Make sure that the thing you're bracketing actually does have a subject and verb and does have a subordinating word. And remember, too, that it needs to be attached to an independent clause to work in a sentence. A subordinate clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence. Okay, we started talking about complex sentences with adverb clauses. We started with adverb clauses first because they really are the simplest of the subordinate clauses. And remember, we said that adverb clauses show adverbial concepts like time, place, manner, cause, concession. Wait, I should change the color. This is getting boring. All right, this is like turquoise. Yes, yeah, that's much better. Adverb clauses subordinate with subordinating conjunctions. Okay, so here's an example. Although Grant's new mohawk is held in place with glue, it looks very natural. Okay, that's not actually a photo of Grant, but that mohawk is almost as spectacular as Grant's is. So, okay, do you see our adverb clause here? Although Grant's new mohawk is held in place with glue. Okay, and here's our subject, and here's our verb, and then here's the subject and verb of the independent clause. And here, although, is our subordinating word of concession, right? Okay, like you're kind of conceding this. Okay, and again, as is typical with most adverb clauses, when you bracket off the adverb clause, you can see that the independent clause really can just stand there very nicely by itself. It's not grammatically incomplete in any way. It looks very natural is our independent clause. Okay, a sentence with an adjective clause. Again, we were saying last time about when we're talking about adverb clauses a second ago, that their function is to show these adverbial concepts of time, manner, place, condition, cause, those 10 categories your book had. Well, the function of an adjective, of course, an adjective clause, regardless of whether you're talking about a one-word adjective or an entire adjective clause, is to modify a noun or a pronoun. And again, when you think something might be an adjective clause, ask yourself, what noun or pronoun is it modifying? If you can't answer that, it can't possibly be an adjective clause. Remember that adjective clauses, too, can be restrictive or non-restrictive. The non-restrictive adjective clause is the one that has the commas, a pair of commas enclosing it. And what we mean by that, again, is that the information inside the non-restrictive adjective clause isn't absolutely crucial to identify the noun that it's modifying. It's still modifying that noun, it's just not identifying it as importantly as a restrictive adjective clause is. And adjective clauses almost always subordinate with relative pronouns. And again, remember that those are pronouns, which means that they're going to have a noun function within the clause, unlike the conjunctions that subordinate for adverb clauses. So here's our example sentence. Carl's Deli, which is across from St. Mary's Hospital, has great pastrami. They really do. Have you ever been there? It's on Clayton, across from the hospital. Yeah, They're just enormous. These pastrami sandwiches are, yeah. They're not quite that big, but they're very big. They're terrific. Carl's Deli is not a sponsor of the traditional grammar video reviews. I'm just pointing that out. Well, anyway, you see our adjective clause here, which is across from St. Mary's Hospital. And we always want to ask, what noun is it modifying? Very obviously, Carl's Deli, right? And do you see that our subordinating word, our relative pronoun here, is which? And remember that because it's a pronoun, we want to ask what noun function it has. And this pretty obviously is the subject of is inside the adjective clause. It's actually functioning as the subject of the adjective clause. Our independent clause, of course, is Carl's Deli has great pastrami. Carl's Deli is the subject of has. And we're saying this is non-restrictive. I mean, we have the pair of commas. I know that's one obvious clue, but even if we didn't have the commas to go by, I think you'd say this is non-restrictive, right? Because we're very clearly identifying Carl's Deli by name, and there's only one, I think, as far as I know, there's only one. So we don't need to distinguish it from other Carl's Delis, Like if we were talking about a McDonald's, we would need to say which one we were talking about. But here, the fact that it's across from St. Mary's Hospital is kind of additional information, but it's not really defining which Carl's Deli we're talking about. Let's look a little bit at complex sentences with noun clauses. They're not bad things. They're good. But they're challenging, and they're difficult because they're different from adjective clauses and adverb clauses. One of the big differences is that noun clauses, of course, don't modify the way adjectives and adverbs do. Single word nouns don't modify either. Only adjectives and adverbs modify. So they don't modify. And because they perform a noun role, they function like a noun, which means they might be a subject, they might be a direct object, they might be a subjective complement. Because they perform a noun role, they can't be separated from the independent clause as cleanly as adjective clauses or adverb clauses usually can. We can't do that because if we take out a subject here, or a direct object, or a subjective complement, or an object of a preposition, we're removing a really important component in the sentence pattern. We're removing something that's integral to the grammatical structure of the clause. It's not just modifying it in some way, but the clause doesn't make any sense without a subject, for example. If you take the noun clause out, you'll probably have a weird hole, and you won't just have an independent clause that stands by itself. That, of course, to make things complicated, because that's why it's interesting, because there's always a complication. But that doesn't work with the appositive noun clause. Remember, the appositive noun clause is the one that you actually can take out and still have a nice independent clause. Noun clauses subordinate with various parts of speech, also to complicate things. You don't need to worry about that too much. Again, they're just more complicated than adverb clauses and adjective clauses. It's important that you can recognize the boundaries of the noun clause, like where you would put the brackets, and that you can identify what noun task that clause is performing. So here's an example. The meteorologist predicted when the rain will start. When the rain will start. Do you see that this is our noun clause right here? When the rain will start. Now notice it's subordinating with the word when, and that would maybe make some people think this might be an adverb clause because it's talking about a time concept, right? And time is usually adverbial. But this doesn't behave like an adverb clause for kind of a few reasons. One, remember with an adverb clause, you can usually move the adverb clause around. We couldn't say, when the rain will start, comma, the meteorologist predicted. That doesn't work. And another thing we can see is that, again, with an adverb clause, remember we can very often remove the adverb clause and still have an independent clause that makes sense. Here, if we do that, we're just left with the meteorologist predicted. And since predicted is a transitive verb, we're missing something. We need to know what the meteorologist predicted. So do you see that when the rain will start is our noun clause? That whole thing is our noun clause. And it's a noun clause because of how it functions. It is functioning as the direct object of predicted. So do you see, remember we were talking about the this Jennifer test. Do you see if you replace when the rain will start with this, that you can see that it's functioning as the direct object exactly the way it's functioning as the direct object if we have the whole clause there with all those individual words? Okay, so the meteorologist predicted this. So remember about clauses in general. Clause always needs a subject and a verb. It's not a clause otherwise. Remember that a subordinate clause needs a subordinating word, even though it might be left off. So, just to sort of keep in mind how you distinguish these three clauses from one another. Because in the real world and on your test, the clauses aren't going to be separated for you. It's not like, if you're reading a Faulkner novel that he's going to say, okay, in this chapter I'm only going to use noun clauses. And then in this next chapter, I'll only use adverb clauses. Of course, it doesn't work that way. And on the tests, too, I'm not just going to have one page of only adverb clauses or one page of only noun clauses. I'm going to give you a bunch of sentences that have subordinate clauses in them, and you have to figure out which one is which. So one way you can figure out whether you're dealing with an adverb clause is to ask yourself which one of those 10 categories it fits into. Remember, your book talked about concession, condition, time, cause, manner. Which one of those would it be? If you can't answer that, look again. It might not be an adverb clause. That's why those 10 categories are most helpful, because it's going to help you identify an adverb clause. And if you think you might have an adjective clause, always ask yourself what noun or pronoun it's modifying. That should be easy to answer. That's usually a very obvious relationship between the adjective clause and the noun it's modifying. Also remember that an adjective clause is almost always right after the noun it's modifying. Not 100% of the time, of course, but almost always it's right after the noun it's modifying. Ask yourself what noun or pronoun it's modifying. If you can't answer that, look again. It might not be an adjective clause. And finally, if you think you might have a noun clause, ask yourself what noun function it's performing. Is it a subject? Is it a direct object? Is it an object of a preposition, a subjective complement? Again, if you can't answer that, look again, because it might not be a noun clause. That's how you determine it's a noun clause, because of how it functions. That's why we're calling it a noun clause. Okay, some more noun clause tips. Remember the this Jennifer trick. That's useful much of the time. It will not work with the appositive noun clause, and it won't really work with the delayed noun clause, which is the one that has it, and then the noun clause coming after. Those are kind of the odd cases. But it should work with noun clauses that are subjects, direct objects, objects of prepositions, subjective complements. So the this Jennifer trick, which is actually my own little test, should have a trademark there, the Barbara's trademark, this Jennifer trick. Okay, noun clauses can often be replaced with this if they're sort of thing, concept noun clauses, or Jennifer if they represent a person. Like a noun clause that subordinates with whoever, for example, would be a person. Let's look at some sentences and try the this Jennifer trick. I know what you did last summer. I know what you did last summer. Do you see that the noun clause is what you did last summer? I know what you did last summer. I know this. So you can see it's the direct object. What you did last summer is the direct object. What about this one? What you told me was fascinating. What you told me was fascinating. This was fascinating. What you told me was fascinating. Can you see that the noun clause here, what you told me, is the subject of was fascinating, just as this is the subject of was fascinating? Whoever broke the mirror is obviously a vampire. Can you see that whoever broke the mirror is the noun clause? And since this is a person, we should be able to replace it with Jennifer. Jennifer is obviously a vampire. whoever broke the mirror, Jennifer. Regardless of whether we have the one word Jennifer or the entire noun clause, whoever broke the mirror, we're dealing with the subject of is obviously a vampire. Let's look at these practice sentences. Now, I'm not italicizing the clauses for you, and I'm not telling you what kind of clauses these are. Let's take a look at these. The Grand Canyon, which is in Arizona, is 277 miles long. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? You have to go to the Grand Canyon if you've never been there. It's really something. You can also go on Google Earth, which is amazingly realistic. I didn't do well with the flight simulator in the Grand Canyon. So I think I should stick to the sort of ground level version, but okay, well. I recommend going to the Grand Canyon in Google Earth, okay? All right, do you see that our subordinate clause here is which is in Arizona? Which is in Arizona? Pretty obviously modifying Grand Canyon, right? The relative pronoun which is functioning as the subject of the verb is inside that adjective clause because it's modifying Grand Canyon. Now, if you would be tempted to say that this was an adverb clause of place because it's kind of telling us where something is, you could see in a couple ways that that wouldn't work if you thought it through a little bit more. For one thing, we couldn't move which is in Arizona anywhere else. We couldn't say which is in Arizona, comma, the Grand Canyon is 277 miles long. That doesn't work at all. Also, notice that the subordinating word which is functioning as a subject. In adverb clauses, the subordinating word doesn't function as a subject. So, you can really, knowing what you know about clauses, you can eliminate the two clauses it could not possibly be and narrow it down to the one clause that it has to be. It's just a matter of thinking it through enough. Okay, look at number 2 here. Geologists still argue about what formed the canyon. What formed the canyon is our subordinate clause. Geologists still argue about this. Okay, this is a noun clause that's functioning as the object of the preposition about. Not all agree on whether the canyon was formed by the Colorado River. Whether the canyon was formed by the Colorado River. Nice passive voice verb here, remember those? Okay, canyon was formed. Again, this is a noun clause that's the object of the preposition on. And again, do you see that if you wanted to call this an adverb clause, that wouldn't work at all. You couldn't move this somewhere else in the sentence. Adverb clauses don't subordinate with whether. If you wanted to call it an adjective clause, you'd have trouble right away when you tried to answer what noun it was modifying. So noun clause is the obvious one. And again, not all agree on this. The this test works really well there too. Many visitors are drawn to the canyon because it is wildly beautiful. Because it is wildly beautiful. Pretty obviously adverb of cause, right? Adverb cause. And again, here you can see you could move this whole thing to the beginning of the sentence. Because it is wildly beautiful, comma, many visitors are drawn to the canyon. All right. Although it is beautiful, it can be deadly to inexperienced hikers. That's another adverb clause of concession. And that one too could, we could move that to the end. It can be deadly to inexperienced hikers, comma, although it is beautiful. We probably wouldn't say it that way, but you could. And that, again, that isn't going to work with adjective clauses or noun clauses, so that you can reposition them like that most of the time. I'm always nervous that there's going to be some exception, but okay. Let's look at the last two, and they really kind of go together. They stayed in Bright Angel Lodge, which was designed by Mary Coulter, one of the first female architects in the country. They stayed in the lodge that was designed by Mary Coulter. So look at, they're both adjective clauses modifying lodge, right? That's pretty obvious. But notice that number 6 is non-restrictive. We have a comma and we have a which. Number 7 is restrictive. We have a that and we have no comma. And can you see why 6 needs to be non-restrictive and 7 needs to be restrictive? Because Bright Angel Lodge is named very specifically. There's only one. We don't need to distinguish it from other Bright Angel Lodges. So it's not that the fact that it was designed by Mary Coulter helps us know which Bright Angel Lodge we're talking about. There's only one. I like the sign about not feeding the animals. You have that all over the park, right? Don't feed the animals. Totally ignored. No one pays any attention to this. The last time I was there, I saw 2 kids feeding Skittles to a squirrel. You know a Skittle? It was just the neon colors of the Skittles were just so incongruous in this dramatic scenery of the Grand Canyon, but that's how it is. That's what people do. Okay, well, anyway. Okay, so they stayed in the lodge that was designed by Mary Coulter. Okay, in this case, we've made this adjective clause restrictive because we need to know which lodge we're talking about. So do you see the difference between the relationship between which was designed by Mary Coulter and Bright Angel Lodge as opposed to that was designed by Mary Coulter and the lodge? We don't know which lodge we mean in number 7. We need to know specifically that we're talking about the one that was designed by Mary Coulter. Okay, time's up. That's it.